I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip. The liquid was slightly spicy, sliding down my throat with a trace of coldness. Tonight was George's company's annual gala. The grand banquet hall shimmered with dazzling lights, filled with the clinking of glasses and the mingling scents of champagne and expensive perfume. Men in tailored suits laughed and conversed, while women, draped in luxury, competed in a silent battle of beauty and elegance. I stood in the crowd, blending into the background like an unnoticed fixture, something placed in the wrong spot, yet too insignificant for anyone to move. A woman in a Chanel suit suddenly approached me, her tone light but laced with a hint of condescension. "Sarah, you're looking understated tonight." She deliberately stretched out the word understated, her eyes flickering with a subtle trace of disdain. Instinctively, I straightened my back, adjusting the shawl draped over my shoulders, trying to summon a confidence I wasn't sure I possessed. "She always is," George interjected, his voice steady and casual, like a thin blade slicing effortlessly through the air, cutting just deep enough to wound but not to bleed. "She's never been one to care about brands. Don't expect her to have the same taste the way you all do." He said it lightly, almost playfully, but the laughter that rippled through the small circle of onlookers carried something sharper, something knowing, something cruel. My fingers trembled slightly, the surface of my wine rippling in response. Not everyone can afford Chanel, but not everyone would think it's proper to openly degrade their own wife in front of an audience. A sharp pain twisted in my chest, as if someone had taken a knife and carved straight through me. It was true, I wasn't a socialite. My days were consumed by work, leaving me little time to study designer labels like they did. But tonight I had made an effort. I had carefully chosen a well-tailored dress, spent an hour perfecting my makeup, all in the hopes of presenting myself appropriately for an event like this. I had thought it was enough. But in George's eyes, I was still just a woman without taste, someone who would never belong in his world. The wives around me, some were born into wealth. Others had meticulously crafted themselves to fit their husband's status. And then there was me, an outsider to their unspoken hierarchy. I lowered my gaze to the reflection in my wine glass. The distorted image of my own face stared back at me, blurred beneath the ambient light, like a stranger I barely recognized. And suddenly I felt ridiculous. For years I had tried to mold myself into someone George would approve of. I had bent and adjusted, hoping to become a woman he could accept. But now at last I understood, to him I had never been enough. I was just another presence in his life. One he barely acknowledged, one who didn't even deserve a place beside him. "Let's take a group photo," someone suggested, their voice brimming with excitement. Snapping out of my daze, I inhaled deeply and forced a polite smile, rising to stand with the group. The photographer lifted the camera, and I instinctively positioned myself beside George, my lips just beginning to curve upward. "Step back a little." The words floated over to me, light and indifferent. I froze. Before I could react, George continued, his tone as casual as ever. "Your face is a bit big. You're blocking the people behind you." At that moment, it felt as though he had slapped me across the face. Except this wasn't done in private. It was in front of everyone. The silence was brief but suffocating. Expressions shifted. Some concealed amused smirks, others pretended to busy themselves, avoiding the unfolding awkwardness. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting, observing, anticipating my reaction. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, slow and heavy, each beat resounding with a dull ache. George's voice hadn't been loud. But it had been loud enough. Loud enough for everyone to hear. And in that moment I finally realized he had never once cared about my feelings. To him I was nothing more than an accessory. Something to be adjusted, critiqued, and dismissed as he pleased. And I had let him. But why? Why had I endured this for so long? This wasn't my fault. It had never been my fault. Was my face really that big? Well, of course not. But to him even the smallest part of me was too much. Too intrusive, too visible in his world. Mechanically I took a step back. My forced smile frozen in place. The flash went off. For a split second as the light illuminated George's profile, I looked at him, the man I had once loved with all my heart. Once I had believed that my warmth, my devotion, my quiet sacrifices would make him cherish me. Once I had thought I could be the most important person in his life. But reality had stripped away every last illusion. George had never cared. The gala continued. Lights dazzling, glasses clinking, laughter echoing through the room. But inside me, all that remained was emptiness. That night, even after returning home, the weight in my chest refused to lift. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, reaching up to remove my earrings. The practiced smile I had worn all evening, the one I had forced into place for the sake of appearances, finally crumbled. Maybe this day would pass soon enough. But his repeated humiliation, each sharp remark, each subtle jab, had already carved deep cracks into my heart. This wasn't just about tonight's gala. It was about 20 years of marriage. 20 years of him dismissing my worth. Of slowly eroding my confidence until I could barely remember who I was before him. And yet, despite knowing all of this, I still found myself craving his approval. I lifted my head, meeting my own gaze in the mirror, and let out a quiet, bitter laugh. It was time to wake up, wasn't it? Mom, you look really great today. A voice interrupted my thoughts, gentle and sincere. I turned, startled, and saw Andres standing in the doorway. He was smiling, an easy, untainted smile, his eyes bright and pure, so different from the calculating, insincere looks I had faced all night. His words hit me like a beam of light, piercing through the humiliation and settling deep in my heart. A lump rose in my throat. I reached out and ruffled his hair. Thank you. I tried a little harder today. His smile widened, warm and full of genuine appreciation. And for a fleeting moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Because Andres' compliment was so simple, so straightforward. And yet he was the only one who had acknowledged my effort tonight. I thought for a second that maybe the weight of the day had finally lifted. But then, do you even have a waist? Wearing a dress like that? George's voice cut through the warmth like a blade, sharp and effortless. My breath caught in my throat. Just a few words. That was all it took. It felt like an invisible hand had reached inside me and clenched around my lungs, squeezing the air out of them. In the living room, George lounged on the couch, a tablet in his hands, not even bothering to look up. It's too loose. No shape at all. His tone was casual, indifferent, yet laced with something insidious, like he wasn't critiquing a person, but an unsatisfactory piece of merchandise. A few hours ago, under the dazzling lights of the gala, he had told me to step back because my face was too big. And now, under the softer glow of our own home, he had stripped away the last bit of confidence I had managed to hold on to. I lowered my head, looking at the lilac dress I had chosen so carefully. This was supposed to be my dress. The one I had picked out with intention, the one that Andres had found beautiful. But to George, I was nothing more than a woman growing older, losing her firmness, losing her value. Andres' face darkened. He turned toward his father as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he stayed silent. Still, I could see it, he was angry. But he was just a boy. His anger could not save me. My fingers curled into my palms, my nails pressing so hard into my skin that I nearly broke through it. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and heavy, pounding in my ears. I had heard George mock me before. But tonight, after the humiliation at the gala, after this final degradation, I was finally fully awake. This man did not love me. He did not even respect me. He had spent years stepping over my dignity like it was second nature. And I had spent just as long letting him. The silence between us thickened, unnatural and suffocating. For once, I did not force a laugh to change the subject. I did not lower my head and quietly endure. I simply turned around, walked into the bedroom and shut the door behind me. As if, at long last, I was closing myself off, from this house, from this marriage. From him. The room was dimly lit. I walked to the mirror and stared at the woman reflected in it. Why did his words still have the power to hurt me? After all these years, had I still not learned to stop caring? I should have known better. 5 years ago I made my first real fortune. Our company had landed a major contract. I worked tirelessly for months. Endless late nights, relentless effort. Until we finally delivered, securing my first significant earnings, money that was truly my own. I had rushed home that evening, my heart brimming with excitement, holding the signed contract in my hands like a prize. Look at this. I beamed at George. This is the project we just completed. We did it. We actually made it. George glanced at the contract, the corner of his mouth curling ever so slightly. For a brief moment I thought he would praise me. I had even dared to imagine a simple "you did great." Just a few words, just enough to make me feel seen. But instead he said, "That's it." His tone was casual, dismissive. Not that impressive. The rush of warmth in my chest turned to ice. He flipped through the pages carelessly before tossing the contract onto the table, as if it were nothing more than a grocery receipt. I swallowed the sting of disappointment and asked, "But don't you think this is something to be proud of?" He took a slow sip of his tea, his voice as indifferent as ever. "Look at your MBA classmates. Six-figure salaries. Balancing their careers and families perfectly. And you? Making this kind of money and you think it's worth celebrating." I stared at the contract on the table. The last trace of excitement drained from me, vanishing into the silence between us. I had once yearned for his approval. But now all I wanted was to get away from this house. I could feel it, years of unspoken hurt, of silent endurance, of choked back words, all of it pressing against the edges of me, ready to break. I didn't know when it would all come crashing down. But I knew one thing for certain. It finally will. This day had finally come. Tonight was supposed to be a night of celebration, at least. That's how it looked from the outside. The dining table was beautifully set, the lighting soft, the dishes abundant. By all appearances, it should have been a warm and joyous occasion. George's parents came over to have dinner with us tonight. George sat at the head of the table, and beside him was Andres, looking slightly tense, as if he had already sensed what was coming. Andres had been accepted into a prestigious private high school. A milestone for our family. But I knew the truth. This wasn't a celebration. It was just another opportunity for George to belittle me. And, as expected, he didn't disappoint. Halfway through the conversation, he spoke in that casual, offhand tone of his, as if making a mere observation. Andres was lucky to get into that school. A chill ran through me. This wasn't praise. This was a typical George-style remark. Lucky. Implying that it wasn't due to ability, but rather some stroke of fortune that had fallen from the sky. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he added, "Of course, it's got nothing to do with you. What could you possibly teach him?" The atmosphere around the table stiffened. George continued cutting his steak. Oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the silence that had settled over us. As if completely unaware of the weight of his words, he added with a sigh, "I mean, you can't even manage your own career. And now you think you can educate a child?" Honestly, he shook his head in mock disappointment, his tone more fitting for a manager criticizing an incompetent employee than a husband speaking to his wife. The sound of his knife scraping against the plate rang sharp and grating in my ears. And with it, something inside me snapped. This was George. This was the man I had endured for 20 years. But tonight I had no intention of enduring anymore. I picked up my wine glass and let my gaze slowly sweep across the familiar faces at the table. George's parents, my son, and finally George himself. They were all waiting. Waiting for me to react. Waiting for me to lower my head, to smile politely, to swallow my pride just like I always did. But this time I would not be silent. I smiled. A calm, composed smile. And then I spoke. "I want a divorce." The table fell into dead silence. The air grew so heavy, so still, that even the soft clinking of utensils against porcelain ceased. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady, resolute. And for the first time in a long, long while I felt completely clear-headed. Finally I had said it. George froze for a brief moment, then let out a sharp laugh as if I had just told the most ridiculous joke. "Are you out of your mind? You want a divorce just because of my few words?" His voice dripped with sarcasm, with mockery. The way he looked at me, condescending, amused, made it clear he thought this was nothing more than a childish tantrum, something I'd regret by morning. I met his gaze head-on, my voice calm but unwavering. "It's not just a few words. It's 20 years of disrespect and contempt." His smirk faded. His expression darkened, his posture shifting forward as he placed his knife and fork down with an irritated clatter. "You think you can leave me?" His voice sharpened, laced with incredulity. "How do you plan to survive without me? Without me you're nothing." His words echoed through the dining room, his presence looming, pressing down with an unmistakable force. His mother stiffened at his outburst, then turned to me with a sharp frown. Sarah, don't be foolish. A woman's place is to keep the family together. Don't let all this talk of independence lead you astray. His father shook his head, setting his silverware down with a disapproving sigh. What nonsense. No matter how much George upsets you, he's still your husband. Do you really think you'll get anywhere on your own? I listened to their words and suddenly I felt like laughing. These people who had never once acknowledged my effort, never once recognized my worth. To them, I had always been nothing more than an extension of George, an accessory without a name, without an identity of my own. But they didn't know. They didn't realize that the woman sitting before them was no longer the same woman who had silently endured all these years. I set down my wine glass and let my gaze sweep across the table once more, my voice even and unhurried. Yet each word sharp as a blade. Every dollar I have now, I earned myself. George has given me nothing but ridicule. George's mother's face twisted into a scowl. You're being ridiculous. But George was no longer just irritated. He was furious. He shot up from his seat, palms slamming against the table as he glared down at me, eyes burning with anger and humiliation. You think you're somebody? His voice was sharp, almost venomous. You're just an aging housewife with no real skills. What the hell do you think you can do out there? You think you can survive without me? I stood as well, slowly, deliberately. And when I looked at him, there was no fear in my eyes. Only clarity. Not just survive. My voice was quiet but unwavering. I'll live better than I ever did with you. The room seemed to freeze. Every pair of eyes was on me as if they couldn't believe that I, the woman they had always dismissed, the wife they had always controlled, was the one saying these words. At that moment, the sound of Andres setting down his chopsticks cut through the tense silence. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the room, it landed like a gavel striking a verdict. I support Mom. Every head at the table turned toward him. George's face darkened instantly. He whipped his gaze to Andres, his voice sharp with anger. What nonsense are you talking about? Cut it off. But Andres didn't shrink back. He straightened his spine, his eyes steady and unwavering as he met mine. I've watched Mom endure this my entire life. Dad, you've never respected her. Now that she finally wants to leave, of course I support her. The weight of his words settled over the table like a heavy stone. George's mother's face twisted in outrage. His father's expression shifted into something more complicated, something between disapproval and reluctance. But me, for the first time in years, I felt something warm bloom in my chest. Something fierce, something unshakable. I tightened my grip around Andres' hand, my throat tightening, my eyes stinging, but not a single tear fell. George's face turned red with fury. He slammed a hand on the table, pointing an accusatory finger at Andres. You're just a shallow teenager. What do you know? Everything you have, your clothes, your education, who do you think paid for it? Andres lifted his chin, his voice eerily calm. I'd rather have a happy mom. A single sentence. But it landed like a hammer against the table, reverberating through the room with undeniable finality. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. George's mouth opened slightly, but for once he had nothing to say. I took a deep breath, picked up my purse, and exhaled. I've made my decision. You'll be getting the divorce papers soon. One last glance at them, at the faces I had once tried so hard to please. Then with my head held high, I took Andres' hand and walked out. Behind me, George's furious shouting rang out, his mother's shrill reprimands cutting through the air, his father's deep sigh following in their wake. But none of it could touch me anymore. The first day after the divorce, Andres and I moved into our new apartment. It wasn't large. The furniture was simple. But the moment I opened the window, the crisp evening air rushed in. Carrying something I had almost forgotten, the scent of freedom. Beyond the skyline, the city shimmered under a canopy of lights, stretching endlessly into the night. I stood by the window, cradling a warm cup of tea, staring into the distance, my mind utterly clear. For 20 years, my world had revolved around George. His preferences had dictated my choices. His indifference had been my routine. His neglect had felt like my fate. But now I could finally live for myself. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling through the apartment window. No harsh words. No cold stares. No suffocating presence looming over me. Just warmth. Just quiet. Just peace. At our small dining table, Andres and I sat together eating a simple breakfast. He looked up at me suddenly, studying me for a moment before speaking. "Mom, you seem different." I smiled, curious. "Different how?" He hesitated, then said, "You just look happier." My hand paused for a fraction of a second, warmth blooming in my chest. I let the words settle. Let myself feel the truth in them. Yes. I was finally free. But freedom came at a price. The price of starting over. For years I had lived in George's shadow. While I had never directly managed a company, I had absorbed enough to understand the business world. But I didn't just want to participate, I wanted to build something of my own. I poured all my savings into a startup, a consulting firm focused on women's career development. This wasn't just a job. It was a declaration of who I was and who I was going to be. I had imagined myself sitting in a sleek office, meeting with clients, shaping industries with confidence and ease. Reality was far less glamorous. I couldn't even afford an office. My dining table became my makeshift desk. Days were spent chasing leads, nights drafting business plans. I closed my laptop at 2 a.m., only to wake up at 6 to get Andres to school. I had no network, no experience, no team. Every role, finance, operations, marketing, negotiations, I had to take on myself. I started small, reaching out to female employees in local businesses, offering career training workshops. But convincing them wasn't easy. A recently divorced woman, what advice could I possibly offer? One day I walked into a startup eager to pitch my program. I barely got through my introduction before the male CEO interrupted me with a smirk. "Career training for women? What do you teach them? How to impress their boss? How to dress to be more attractive?" The words hit me like ice water down my spine. For a split second I felt the old doubts creeping in, the urge to shrink back. But I didn't. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "No," I said, voice firm. "We teach women how to negotiate, how to fight for the salary they deserve, and how to become true leaders." He raised an eyebrow, watching me carefully. Then after a pause he nodded. "Fine. I'll give you a trial session." That was my breakthrough. On the day of the trial workshop I stood before a room of 15 women. Some looked skeptical, others hesitant, unsure of why they were there. I didn't use slides. I didn't hide behind statistics. Instead I looked them in the eyes and asked, "Have you ever wondered why men climb the corporate ladder faster? Why, with the same skills, they get paid more?" Some looked down. Others frowned, slightly thoughtful. I smiled. Because they ask for it. And we wait. We wait for someone else to acknowledge our worth. I'm here to teach you how to stop waiting and start claiming your place. And for the first time I saw it, the flicker of recognition in their eyes. By the end of that session I secured my first official client. Then came the second, third. More companies started reaching out. My courses gained traction, especially among women who had spent years fighting for recognition in male-dominated industries. But the real turning point was when I was introduced by a friend to a senior women's leadership group in a multinational corporation. They believed in my vision. They wanted to collaborate. This wasn't just another workshop. This was a seat at the table. If I succeeded, my work wouldn't just impact individuals. It would influence corporate policies, leadership training, and executive decision-making. But there was a catch. I had 1 week to submit a full-scale training proposal. For the next 7 days I barely slept. I drowned myself in research, refining every detail, crafting the perfect pitch. One night as I sat at my laptop, exhausted and overwhelmed, Andres appeared by my side. He held out a cup of warm milk, concern flickering in his eyes. "Mom, maybe you should rest for a bit?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I have to win." He nodded, then with quiet determination took my hand. "Then I'll stay with you." In that moment, I realized, Andres wasn't just my son. He was my greatest ally. With my carefully crafted proposal in hand, one that had cost me countless sleepless nights, I stood before the senior executives. My heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. The percentage of female executives is rising every year, yet they continue to face structural barriers in their career progression. What we need to do is equip them with real negotiation skills. So they stop being the ones waiting to be chosen and start becoming the ones making the decisions. A few moments later, applause echoed through the conference room. I had secured the deal. At that moment I knew I had won. The first year was brutal. My company barely scraped by, surviving on sheer determination. The second year things began to change. Clients multiplied. Word spread quickly in the industry. I built a solid team and expanded the business beyond women's career training into corporate leadership consulting. I was invited to speak at business forums, sitting alongside CEOs and thought leaders, debating workplace equity. Financial magazines published features on me, calling me the rising star of post-divorce female entrepreneurship. One day I stood in my company's conference room, watching my team passionately discussing market strategies. For the first time in my life I felt something I had never experienced before. True fulfillment. Then came the industry summit. I was invited as a keynote speaker. The grand hall glittered under golden chandeliers, filled with industry leaders, investors, and executives. The air buzzed with anticipation. Flashing cameras turned the stage into a sea of light. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, I took the microphone, my voice clear, confident, unwavering. Women in the workplace are not just executors, they must be decision makers. Too many women are undervalued, overlooked, and sidelined in their careers. My mission is to break those barriers and help them claim their rightful place as leaders. A wave of applause erupted. I smiled. At this moment I stood at the very center of the world's attention. Then as my gaze swept across the audience I saw him. George. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a shadow of the man he once was. His expensive suit was still there, but the collar was slightly wrinkled, the cuffs loose as if he had been through one storm after another. His face was drawn, fatigue visible in the dark circles under his eyes. Even from a distance I could see it, the strain, the hesitation, the silent plea buried beneath his hardened expression. How ironic. The man who once belittled me, who once thought I was nothing without him, now looked lost. A bitter smile flickered at the corner of my lips. Karma had finally caught up. After the speech I mingled with top investors, fully immersed in my world. Then he approached. Sarah. His voice was lower than I remembered. He sounded restrained, tired. I turned to look at him. Can we talk? He stood close but not as imposing as before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Something almost pleading. I met his gaze, calm and unreadable. Then with a polite, effortless smile I said, "Sorry, I'm busy." And just like that I turned away. I walked toward people who mattered. Behind me George stood frozen, his expression crumbling as if my simple, indifferent words had shattered him completely. I later learned that George's company was in serious financial trouble. Mismanagement, declining market share, withdrawn investments, internal chaos. His once unshakable empire was now on the verge of collapse. And the greatest irony. In his desperate search for investors, my company had become one of his potential lifelines. The man who once mocked me, who once dismissed me as worthless, now found himself standing in my world, hoping for my help. If this was fate, I had to admit, it had an impeccable sense of irony. A year passed in the blink of an eye. My company had evolved from a women's career training firm into a global management consulting powerhouse, specializing in leadership development, corporate culture transformation, and market expansion. Our influence stretched across industries and continents. On this day, I stood on stage at a press conference, announcing the success of our latest round of funding. Before me sat a sea of investors, industry leaders, and media professionals. All eyes focused on me. And in the farthest corner a silent, defeated figure watched from the shadows. George. He sat alone, gripping a glass of whiskey, his face pale, his expression a mix of longing and regret. I knew. His company had completely crumbled. He had tried to rebuild, to rally old allies, but his arrogance had burned too many bridges. The same people who once flattered him now avoided him like a plague. And he finally understood. His connections, his resources, his influence had never truly belonged to him. They belonged to his power. And when that power was gone, so was everything else. A few days later, he finally swallowed his pride and sought me out at a private event. He no longer looked superior, no longer carried that air of invincibility. Instead he was tired, hesitant, ashamed. "Sarah, we were married once. Can't you help me? Please?" He tried to use our past, our history as currency. But he had forgotten, we had ceased being husband and wife, a long time ago. I picked up my coffee cup, stirring it slowly, watching the liquid swirl as I let his words linger in the air. Then I lifted my gaze, cool and unwavering. "Funny, isn't it? The useless ex-wife you looked down on is now the one you need." I tilted my head slightly, my voice steady. "But I'm afraid I have no interest in helping you." His face flushed red, his lips trembling, but he couldn't say a word. And in that moment I saw it. His collapse. He finally realized. The woman he had so carelessly discarded had risen to a place he could never reach. If only once, just once, he had valued me, perhaps things would have been different. But there are no second chances in life. I stood up, straightened my coat, and cast him one final glance. Then with a faint smile, I said, "Good luck, George." And with that I turned and walked away without hesitation. Behind me his figure seemed lonelier than ever. But I no longer cared. The days that followed remained busy as ever. But amidst the whirlwind of work, an unexpected chapter began. Through my business ventures I met Robert, a renowned investor. Known for his strategic precision and steady hand in corporate restructuring, he was often hailed by the media as the magician of business revival. But what intrigued me about him wasn't his wealth. It was his attitude toward women in leadership. In this industry, no matter how successful a woman is, some still reduce her achievements to luck or a powerful benefactor's favor. Many male investors I worked with, no matter how polite, carried a subtle condescension, as if they were the real gatekeepers of power, merely allowing women to play the game. But Robert was different. He never sugar-coated his words to win me over, nor did he try to test me with veiled arrogance. He spoke to me as an equal. Every discussion with him felt like a true intellectual exchange, free of patronizing remarks or gendered undertones. And for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar in the business world, a sense of ease. We collaborated on a few projects, each one progressing seamlessly. He was patient, thorough, and occasionally after a meeting he would invite me to dinner. I knew it wasn't just business etiquette, he was interested in me. One evening at a corporate gala, we stood on a balcony, gazing over the city's endless sea of neon lights. Then he spoke. "Sarah, you once said that a woman can be both powerful and happy." I turned to look at him. "So tell me, what does happiness mean to you?" "Happiness." For a moment, I had no answer. I lifted my wine glass and took a slow sip. Then softly I said, "Happiness is freedom." He seemed slightly taken aback before a thoughtful smile curved his lips. "If one day you no longer want to be alone, I hope you'll think of me." His voice was deep and steady, not demanding, not expectant. Just a quiet offering, like an invitation with no expiration date. I didn't respond. I simply smiled. Robert was a good man. But deep within me, there was still a wall that no one could cross. I had grown too accustomed to standing on my own. And I had no desire to be bound by anyone ever again. Meanwhile, George had hit rock bottom. His company had finally crumbled. Its market share devoured by competitors, investors pulling out, banks closing in on debts, and employees abandoning ship in droves. The once untouchable man was now someone everyone avoided. A cautionary tale of failure. Even his parents, who had once proudly paraded him as the family's shining star, now refused to mention his name. And yet, amidst the ruins of his life, I became his last obsession. He began appearing at my events. Every time I could feel his gaze, full of regret, conflict, resentment, and perhaps delusion. Did he still think I would soften? Did he still believe there was a chance for us? Finally, after a business summit, as I was about to leave, he stepped in front of me. I stopped, looking at him calmly. He was even more hollowed out than before. His suit no longer crisp, his expression heavy with exhaustion, his eyes carrying a weariness I had never seen in him before. His lips parted as if to say something, but in the end, all that came out was a quiet, broken whisper. "I know I treated you terribly. I shouldn't. I truly regret it." I didn't respond right away. His eyes held a deep, unspoken pain, a silent plea for forgiveness. "I was wrong," he murmured, his voice shaking. "Why didn't I cherish you when I had the chance? I looked at him, but there was no anger in my heart, no satisfaction in seeing him like this. Only indifference. Some mistakes can never be undone. He stood frozen, his lips trembling, waiting. For what? For me to give him a second chance. For me to be the woman I once was. The one who endured. Forgave, stayed. Too bad. He had waited too long. Do you remember? I said softly. You once told me I was worthless. His face turned deathly pale. My voice remained steady, my gaze clear. Do you still believe that now? His head dropped, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails nearly pierced his palms. His defeat was absolute, etched into every line on his face. This time he had truly lost. I looked at him, devoid of sentiment, devoid of mercy. You once believed I was just an extension of you. But now, you finally understand, the one who can't live without me is you. And unfortunately for you, I no longer belong to you. Robert's pursuit had once made me hesitate. George's remorse had once stirred a fleeting moment of sympathy. But in the end I chose myself. At a private gathering, long after most guests had left, Robert turned to me and said, "If there ever comes a day when you're ready to explore something new, I'll be here." I smiled. I neither agreed nor refused. Because I already had everything I needed. That night I stood by my floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the dazzling city lights. And then I laughed softly. I belonged to no one. I belonged only to myself.